Welcome back to Global Impacts and week 9, where we'll be looking at garment production. Probably the Achilles heel of the fashion industry because it's the stage in which the industry understands the issues, certainly aware of the issues and understand them, may not have the answers, but and it's also the stage or the stage in the product life cycle where the customers understand the issues as well. So if there's one criticism that can be levied at fashion brands, it may well be this first stage. And I've titled it, it's all about the cost per unit because by and large, mainstream brands are driven by unit costs and trying to get that as low as possible. So not many more stages to go now. We're going to, obviously last week we dyed the fabric or the fiber, and now we're at the stage of actually making a garment. So we're going to look at predominantly at the social issues uh, around making a garment, and then briefly in the end we'll look at a couple of slides on environmental issues which play a lesser role in this. Don't forget again, people with nature model, this is for the past component of your assessment. Hopefully you've had a look at that other video that I put up on how to prepare for the final assessment. But we're asking ourselves two questions. What resources are we taking out of the earth systems to manufacture the garment? What happens when we manufacture the garment? So how do we treat people when we make those garments? And then finally, what goes back into the ecosystem? And our two models, planetary boundaries and the social economy or donut economics, the terms are interchangeable, so you can use either one. Um, and remembering we're looking at, will any of these aspects here be influenced by the manufacture of the garment? Okay, we'll start with the elephant in the room, and that is sweatshops. So if we look at the definition of it, a sweatshop employing workers at low wages for long hours and under poor conditions. So basically a pretty unpleasant environment to work in. Pretty common in the fashion industry. And as I said before, it's the area where you're most likely to get criticism from the public about those conditions. So why do they exist? Well, firstly, there's pressure from buyers. So a buyer goes overseas, and if you, as a buyer in the coming years, will find out that your boss will basically say to you, buy, but at this price per unit. So your job is to negotiate down as much as possible the price from the factories. And the factories obviously want to both please you, but also have enough money to pay their staff. So that puts downward pressure on prices. Pressure from external competition, because even if you're not doing that, if you're taking a more moral approach and prepared to pay higher prices, chances are your competition are not. So that forces you into a position of having to um, compete on price or on some other aspect. Thirdly, there's a competitive labour market. There's a lot of people out there willing to work in garment factories. And we'll talk about that in a moment as to why. And the final one I sort of put in here is groupthink. Where is it here? Just the definition of it, I've just whipped up there. Group is a phenomenon that occurs when a group of individuals reaches a consensus without critical reasoning or evaluation of the consequence or alternative. So they stop thinking and they just go along with the pack. You might have experienced this in some of your triad groups. Sometimes when you're in a meeting, you're tired, you've been there for a long time, and your priority at this point is just to get the meeting over and done with. So you'll kind of agree to anything just to finish it. And also, if there is one person in the group that wants to sort of solve a particular issue, which means extending the meeting, then everyone kind of turns on them. And so there's a bit of sort of anxiety or stress associated with that. And so what the group does subconsciously is just start to behave like a pack rather than a group of intelligent individuals and not think. A classic example has been the rush to buy toilet paper rolls. That's sort of groupthink, where no one's thinking rationally anymore. It's just simply following everyone else in order to get your toilet paper. Now, what that's got to do with the fashion industry is that when you start talking to some of the managers and CEOs in the mainstream brands on this issue of sweatshops, what they'll tend to sort of say is, uh, oh yes, it's an issue, but what can we do about it? Or no, our company sort of is fine. We've sort of inspected the factories, everything's okay. And there's this kind of bland acceptance of the status quo as it is. There's not many managers that sort of go out of their way to say, no, this isn't acceptable. So that's a kind of form of groupthink within the Australian fashion scene um, that slowly is starting to be challenged. Okay, so why sweatshops in the first place? Well, we'll go back to our economic development model, because remember, you can put this in your final assessment answer as well. But, and remember, the premise of this model is that if you want to run a successful business or you want a better chance at your business to be successful, you should operate or you should leverage off the structure of that existing economy. So, what that means is that if you live in a country and in an economy that is agricultural based, then your competitive advantage in fashion lies in deriving resources from the agricultural sector to make your clothes. And we used the example, remember, of, well, this was hemp, but you could use cotton or wool to take advantage of that. If you live in a post-industrial economy, or one that's up here in what's proposed as the fourth industrial revolution, high technology economy, then your best chance of success is to leverage off that technology to improve uh, your business. Doesn't mean you can't still make your garments out of wool or out of cotton, but what it means is that perhaps you promote the fact that you have a transparent supply chain, so you can track exactly where the garment is, who made the garment, under what conditions, and you utilize the technology in that sector. So it's the internet, it's mobile phone tracking, perhaps RFID, if you remember that from last year. You use all of those tools to enhance your business model, so that gives you a competitive advantage. Now, the sweatshops, where they start is because if we go back to our agricultural based economy, when an economy wants to shift into the industrial phase, some of the first factories that get established are garment and apparel factories. Why? Because there's this low barrier to entry, because all you need to start a factory to make clothes is a sewing machine. That's the extent of the technology. Obviously, the more sophisticated the sewing machine, the more sophisticated the garments. But to start off, if you're making basics, you just need a basic sewing machine. So almost anyone with a little bit of cash could start and enter the industry that way. Low level of technology, as I said, um, sewing machines, pretty basic and commonplace, easy to pick up. And also the operation of those sewing machines, the skill levels required are pretty basic. So you can employ someone who's had no training in sewing, and after giving them a few hours, they'll they'll be able to start making clothes, albeit at a basic level. So if we look at some examples of these migration flows, where you've got an abundant workforce, low skills and low education level, but still allows us to employ those people to make clothes. We look at China, for instance, and how you read this is, so these are the provinces around the outside of this ring of China, and you'll notice some of these have arrows. So these are the destination of people within China moving around. So if I track this one, the destination was Beijing, and if we follow it back, they've come from nearby Hebei province and flowed into there. Now, obviously, the biggest intake of people into one region, one province, is Guangdong province, coming from a number of different regions. Hunan, Henan, Guangxi have all come across to Guangdong. So this, what we're seeing with this map is that as factories were being established in Guangdong, Chinese people with low skills, low education, were leaving their homes, traveling to this region to seek jobs in that industry. So you've got a lot of people wanting jobs, therefore there's not much requirement by garment owners, factory owners, to have good conditions in their factories. If we go, where are we? I'll just show you a map of Guangdong so you know where it is. So Guangdong province, provinces are like states, and Guangzhou is the capital, formerly known as Canton. So this was where the garment manufacturing in China in the early 90s was based, and the reason it was based there, it was close to Hong Kong, which at that stage was still controlled by the British, but it was a significant trading port, lots of ships going to the rest of the world. So China started to establish garment manufacturing in this area, and as a consequence, you started to see the flow of people from nearby provinces into Guangzhou looking for work. Because remember, they're coming from, um, you know, rural. Where's a nice picture of a rural setting? There we are. It's in Thailand. But they're coming from that lifestyle, or what we call the agricultural based. If I go back to my little map, where are we? So these are workers that live in this economy, but are seeing opportunities in this new economy. And remember, the higher you are up this economy, the more money you earn, basically, and the better the lifestyle, standard of living, etc. So, oops, where am I? Back there. So huge flows of people throughout China as they seek new jobs. Same can be seen in Bangladesh. If you look at this map, it might be a bit harder for you to see. These are, again, all different districts of Bangladesh. And looking at the two decades, so 91 to 2000, 2000, 2011, these are the migration flows into the cities. So if we look at Dhaka, which is the capital, and in the first decade, up until 2001, that's almost 6 million people in 10 years left their predominantly rural communities to seek work in Dhaka. So that's a phenomenal number of people, 6 million in 10 years, 500,000 a year. Remembering I said with Melbourne, our population growth is 50,000 a year. In the second decade, it was a bit less. It was about, I don't know, 4 million, a bit less than 4 million, 3 million in that decade as well. But absolute explosion of people moving into the city of Dakar, which supports, remember what I was saying a few weeks ago with this is the century of cities. We're seeing more and more people from around the planet gravitating towards cities, and these cities are becoming the economic and lifestyle hubs of places. And again, just to show you a map of Dakar so you know where it is. And it's important to us because this is where Kmart, Target get a lot of their clothes from at the moment. They've chosen to source from Dhaka and Bangladesh, or from Bangladesh. Um, so it's wedged between Burma, India. Oh, this is India here as well. Um, and just near the ports there as well. All along there, there's ports or facilities for loading and unloading. Point of raising this with you, if I go back to our flows again, is that whenever you've got new industries, new emerging industries, you'll get people attracted to those industries. There'll be a lot of competition for jobs in those industries, and therefore there's a strong chance that the conditions in those factories are not going to be too pleasant. Just close the door here. Sorry. Um, okay, let's look at three examples of economic development. And so how the fashion industry, or sorry, the apparel industry, uh, manufacturing industry has changed as it's moved through these stages in our region, starting with South Korea. So this is a bit wordy, but I'm just going to go through the key points on this. So 1953, it was the end of the Korean War and the creation of North and South Korea. Um, Manufacturing had completely collapsed as a consequence of that war. So not much was happening. It was a rebuilding stage in Korea. By the 50s, they started manufacturing textiles because it was the easiest industry to get going quickly. Low skills, low technological requirements, low capital investment. And they started making clothes for themselves, basically. By the 70s, there was a strong export push. So South Korea became, what today people might perceive as, cheap clothes come from China. Well, in my period, as I was growing up, cheap clothes came from South Korea. That was the sort of stuff you'd buy at Kmart at that stage. But by the 80s, they started losing their competitive edge, partly because China started to increase its manufacturing of clothing. So South Korea was in trouble. Their industries were starting to lose money. Some of them were going broke. Wages were going up. So as an economy develops, as it moves up that development curve, wages also follow up and they become uncompetitive. So in the 90s, what they started to do is, so they lost market share in capital intensive processes such as man-made fiber and fabric production to China, Taiwan, and Indonesia, and just simply couldn't compete with those industries. And so by the early 2000s, they started to focus on value adding tech activities such as branding, marketing, designing. So pretty much where Australia is now. So you had this 1950s making garments for the local market, then starting to export those garments overseas, then starting to hit competition from other countries with lower costs, and finally, it's not very feasible to make clothes in South Korea. So they start to emphasize merchandising, product development, exactly what you're doing right now as their aspect. So many countries, Australia followed a similar model. If we look at K-pop again, and just to associate it with pop culture in South Korea, it's all about the styling, the design, the choice of colors, clothes, arranges. And so they no longer make the clothes, but they influence what sort of clothes are made. And often they're now made in different countries. So pretty standard evolution of the fashion industry. China then, similar sort of pattern. So 49 to 78 was quite disruptive. There was a combination of, there was a couple of famines in there. There was the Cultural Revolution, which was disruptive. And there was also an emphasis on heavy industry, such as steel making. So that was the government of the day thought that was the focus. So not much was done with the apparel industry. In 1979, the Premier Deng Xiaoping opened up the Chinese economy and said we're going to start to engage the rest of the world by manufacturing a whole range of products. And one of the first industries again to start was the apparel industry. And it's deemed a golden growth area because you had growth rates of 14%, which, if you run a business and you're growing by 14% a year, you've got a big smile on your face. That's seriously good growth and driven largely by export. So the Chinese government at that stage was saying, make the product, make the garments and sell it to the rest of the world, mainly because they needed foreign currency. Because if you're selling to, say, the US market, you're going to be paid in US dollars. And so that started to see a flood of American dollars come into China, which they could then use to buy equipment and other things. By 2000 to 2013, it was more focused on value adding again, because it wasn't just good enough to make a garment cheaply. You had to accentuate that garment. You had to have more sophisticated garments being sold. And we started to see branding occur here, just like in South Korea. In 2001, they were accepted into the World Trade Organization, which gave them equal access to all the markets in the world, or most markets in the world, which also increased their sales. Sorry, oops. And well, the rest is history. So their problem now, though, is wages are going up, and I'll show you on a slide further on. Um, and as their wages go up, they're becoming less and less competitive, certainly in the low end. but at the top end, they're still quite competitive. Third country is Taiwan. And again, in the 1950s, the government encouraged the establishment of new factories, stimulation of weaving services, providing capital and material resources. American donations of cotton played a crucial role in this success. So they started by getting cotton for free from the Americans. And I'll just bring in a bit of politics in here. The reason was because in the 1950s, the Americans didn't recognize China, mainland China, because it was a communist regime. They treated Taiwan as the real China and refused to talk to mainland China. And so, to prop up the economy in Taiwan, they donated, amongst other things, cotton. And that cotton allowed the Taiwanese economy to build an industry around it. And they were really good, not so much at garment production, but fiber processing, so weaving the fabrics. Um, and the idea was to support manufacturing through import substitution. So for a country that's growing, let me do a little bit of economics here. For a country that's sort of moving up that path, what it doesn't want to do is suck in a lot of imports because that can be quite costly for it. So it tries to do as much as it can in-house and then export as much as it can. So where I said the Chinese were into export orientated, the Taiwanese were into import replacement. So at least they make their own textiles for their own market. In the 50s, in the 60s, the Americans started to wind back their donations and it forced the textile industry to change. And so they moved into artificial fiber plants. So this is the polyesters and other materials that are non-naturally based and move towards more value adding. Again, it's not enough just to make something cheaper. You have to add some extra value to it. And so they enhance forward and backward linkages, which I'll talk about in a moment. So in the 70s, rapid growth of textile and market industry. By the 80s, they started to focus on technology to make their fibers, high-speed equipment, engineering, and they felt that if we own the machines, or if we can make the machines and then sell them to people who will then weave it, uh, they'd be in a better position, and that's what this backward linkages is about. So you might be one chain in the whole process where you make the garment, but what if you own the machine that makes the garment? And what if you own the machine that spins the fiber? So it gives you a lot of strength throughout the whole supply chain, and that was a Taiwanese strategy, slightly different. Um, from the 90s until now, what they started to do, because they became uncompetitive as well in many sectors, but they started to relocate their factories across in China, so mainland China. So relationships between the two countries or the two entities started to change a bit, and you started to see Taiwanese firms go across to, where are we? I'll just show you on a map. There's Taiwan, Fujian. So a lot of Taiwanese owned factories are located in Fujian province there. So it's close. So the intellectual capital is here. Manufacturing occurs in that segment over there. So they're just three examples of how the garment industry evolves over time. You know, you can't keep doing the same thing forever. You've got to change as your economy changes. So the problem is with this change as it occurs, you know, is it a race to the bottom or a race to the top? Certainly what the Taiwanese did was a race to the top because they kept adding value to their supply chain. And by doing that, you create new jobs that usually pay better. Certainly the South Koreans did that because, you know, whereas 30 years ago, if you wanted to get into the fashion industry in South Korea, it meant working in a factory like that. Whereas now, if you want to get into the fashion industry in South Korea, you're more likely to walk into this industry. Still fashion, but a different aspect of it. And again, this is sort of where Australia's at as well. China's um, because of China's size, it can kind of do both. It still has manufacturing, but it's also got the branding and the value adding that occurs. And that can only happen in certain economies, basically big ones. So if we look at the initial stage of economic development, it tends to be associated with low wages. Remember, you get these migrants flowing into a city, um, long hours, poor conditions, or, and I'll throw this out there, is this a subjective interpretation? Is this a Western perspective? Because if I go back, sorry, I'm jumping around now, have a look at this. If I go back here, if you want to get out of the poverty associated with the agricultural stage of economic development, so that's sort of these rural villages, um, not much infrastructure, not good housing, no doctors, etc. If you want to get out of that poverty and grow your economy and grow your own personal standard of living, then you have to work long hours and you have to work for low conditions. And hopefully, the idea is that by doing that, slowly things improve. Now, the criticism is when um, some people highlight these factories and say, oh, they're terrible working conditions. It can be subjective because if you're sitting up here and saying, of course it's going to look poor, but if you're here, then it looks wonderful because you're going to get paid a lot more than if you were down here. So that's where I'm saying you've got to, these aren't simple yes and no answers. These are quite complex in deciding what's fair and equitable. And remember, I'm mentioning this because you as a buyer are going to Bangladesh or China or Vietnam to buy the garments, and you're going to be sourcing from a factory which might have low wages, long hours, and you have to be able to justify that that's acceptable or not. That's tricky. So if we look at that protest, so as I said, the protest has been highlighted. Sorry, protesters over the years have highlighted these issues. If you look at the traditional way we protest, usually it's a rally, it's people gathering in one geographical place. There's usually police on the other side stopping them or containing them in an area. Protest in the 21st century is gone online because the economy has changed now, and a lot of our economy is based online. So protest happens through the virtual world, and when an issue goes viral, it can go global in a very short period of time. So this is something that brands now have to be cognizant of as they see more and more of these campaigns against them emerge. Have a drink. Remember, a few weeks ago, we looked at the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York, and we said, well, this was the catalyst for change in working conditions in the United States as a consequence of this fire. Then in 2013, we had something similar with the collapse of the building in Bangladesh that had garment workers in there. But this time, the campaign, rather than being, protest driven uh, like this, it took on this sort of form. So Avaz here is an example of that, where Avaz is a environmental human rights platform that is modeled around drawing attention to particular issues. So they'll put up a campaign like Our Clothing Kills. They'll put it out there and they'll ask you to sign up to it if you agree with their position on it. And the idea is, so in this case, and they'll have a target, they'll have 2 weeks in which to gather as many signatures as they can. And what this scale shows the protagonists in this case is that, there's over 1 million people that are aware of the issue and don't agree with it. So it's basically a kind of name and shame process. And it's just one of the many online campaigns that are out there that's proved to be quite effective. Usually people, particularly brands, don't like to be associated with it. And if a brand like Benetton, Italian-based brand, realizes that there's over 1 million people that are aware of the association between Benetton and this factory collapse, then there's probably 5 million people um, who have some issue with it. There's 1 million are prepared to sign it, but but 5 million accept that it's not good.